The resignation letter was sitting on Marguerite Osei-Bonsu's desk when she arrived at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, and she almost walked past it. It was in a plain white envelope, unsealed, her name written in her son-in-law's handwriting. Not her title, not CEO Osei-Bonsu Capital Partners. Just Marguerite, the way he'd always said it. Slightly too casual. The way you speak to someone you've already decided doesn't matter. She set her coffee down. She picked up the envelope. She read the letter standing at her own window, looking out over the Toronto skyline, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Nothing. Not hurt. Not surprise. Not even the particular exhaustion that comes from being disappointed by someone you'd given every possible chance to. Just stillness, the way a room feels after a door closes on its own. She folded the letter back into thirds. She placed it in the top drawer of her desk. She sat down, opened her laptop, and by 9:03 she was on a call with Singapore. This is what people who underestimate Marguerite Osei-Bonsu never understand. She has never once needed anyone to see her in order to know exactly who she was. Her daughter Celine had married Rowan Ashby 3 years ago, in September, at a vineyard outside of Niagara-on-the-Lake. It had been a beautiful wedding. Marguerite remembered standing at the back of the ceremony while the guests were seated, watching Rowan wait at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him and thinking, he looks like a man practicing at something. She hadn't said this to anyone. She had smiled when Celine came down the aisle. She had danced at the reception and made a toast that made people cry in the good way, and she had watched Rowan accept congratulations from a room full of people with the ease of someone who was very used to being celebrated. He was charming. That was the word everyone used, and it was accurate. Rowan Ashby was the kind of man who made you feel, in the first 10 minutes of knowing him, that you were the most interesting person he had ever met. It took considerably longer to notice that he was always performing this for someone, that his attention moved like a spotlight. Bright and warm wherever it landed, gone the moment it turned away. Celine had met him at a conference. He was in finance, some kind of portfolio management role at a mid-sized firm downtown. He was good at his job, from what Marguerite could assess, though she noticed early on that he spoke about his work the way people do when they want credit for potential rather than results. When Celine told her they were getting married, Marguerite had said, "I'm happy for you, sweetheart. Are you happy?" Celine had laughed. "Mom, of course I'm happy. Why do you always do that?" Marguerite hadn't answered. She'd hugged her daughter and started thinking about venues. What she'd actually been asking, and what Celine had understood and chosen not to engage with, was something closer to, does he see you? Not the version of you that reflects well on him. You, the actual person, the one who eats cereal at midnight and cries at nature documentaries and calls me at 6 in the morning when she's scared. But you can't ask that at an engagement, so you pick venues. 2 years into the marriage, Rowan came to work for the firm. It had been Celine's idea, or at least Celine had presented it as her idea, though Marguerite had seen it coming for months. Rowan's firm had restructured. There'd been quiet talk of a redundancy. And Celine, who loved her husband in the particular way that made her want to smooth every path before he reached it, had mentioned one evening at dinner that Rowan might be a natural fit for the international markets team. Marguerite had been quiet for a moment. He's family, Celine had said. That's not a conflict. It's a resource. Those two things are not the same, Mom. I'll think about it. She had thought about it. She had consulted her COO, a precise and humorless woman named Dr. Priscilla Kwame Asante, who had no opinion about Rowan Ashby whatsoever and said so clearly, which Marguerite appreciated. She had spoken to her board chair, a retired judge named Honoré Thébault, who raised one eyebrow and said nothing, which she also appreciated. In the end, she brought Rowan on as a senior analyst on a 3-month contract renewable. She told him this directly, across her desk, while he sat across from her with the faint smile of a man who had already decided the outcome. "This is a professional context," she said. "In this building, I'm not your mother-in-law, I'm your employer. The contract terms apply to you exactly as they apply to everyone else." "Of course," he said. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he said it warmly. He said it the way you speak to someone when you have already decided their concerns are slightly beside the point. She had noticed that. She'd filed it somewhere quiet and continued. The 3 months became 6, the 6 became a year. Rowan was professionally capable. He was not exceptional. Marguerite had worked with exceptional people for 30 years and she knew the difference. But he was competent, organized, and very good at being visible at the right moments. What she noticed, more gradually, was the way he talked about her when she wasn't in the room. She noticed it the way you notice a draughty window in winter, not all at once but in accumulated moments. A joke at a team lunch that she heard about secondhand. A comment at a client dinner that her assistant, a careful young man named Tobias, mentioned with studied neutrality. A dynamic she observed in the set of certain colleagues' shoulders when Rowan spoke about strategy. The slight loosening that happens when someone has convinced a room that the authority above them is more form than substance. She understood slowly, been positioning himself as the practical center of the firm. The one who actually understood the numbers, the markets, the real work. And Marguerite, with her degrees from McGill and the London School of Economics, with the 3 decades she had spent building this firm from a 2-person operation in a Bloor Street office into a 70-person shop managing nearly $4 billion in assets, had been gently, consistently reframed as a figurehead, a name on a door. He had done this carefully. He had never said anything she could point to directly. He was too charming for that. She had watched it happen and said nothing, because Marguerite Osei-Bonsu had spent her entire career being underestimated by people who were very certain they were the first to think of it. And she had learned something important. There is a particular kind of patience that looks like passivity. It is not. The letter she found on her desk that Tuesday morning said, essentially, that Rowan was leaving to start his own fund. He had written it in the formal register of someone who expects the document to be referenced later, which told her he had consulted a lawyer. He thanked her for the opportunity. He wished the firm well. He said he was confident the timing would not cause undue disruption, which was a remarkable thing to say given that he had apparently spent the last several months having quiet conversations with 4 of her 7 managing directors. Marguerite had known about the conversations. Tobias kept meticulous notes. She had also known about the investor meeting Rowan had held 3 weeks ago at a hotel on Wellington Street, which he had attended with 2 of those managing directors and a man named Clifford Adebayo who ran a small family office in Mississauga. Clifford was an old acquaintance of Rowan's from his previous firm. He had, according to Tobias's notes, expressed interest in anchoring a new vehicle with an initial commitment of $8 million. $8 million. As a founding anchor. For a fund with no track record, no infrastructure, and a management team that consisted of Rowan and 2 analysts who were good at seeming confident in rooms. Marguerite had looked at the notes and felt something she recognized as almost tender. Not for Rowan. For the version of herself that might have 25 years ago made a similar bet on a similar kind of man and called it vision. She had made no such bet. She had built a firm. She opened her laptop on that Tuesday morning, put the letter in the drawer, and called Singapore. The fund launched in February. There was a small piece in the Globe and Mail, the financial section below the fold. Rowan had been quoted saying that he saw an opportunity to build something leaner, more agile, truly client-centric. He had not mentioned Osei-Bonsu Capital Partners by name, though the implication was clear enough to anyone who knew the context. He described his vision for the fund with the fluency of someone who had spent a lot of time in front of a mirror practicing. Marguerite read the piece on her phone on the GO train. On her way back from a weekend in Collingwood with her sister, she set her phone face down on the seat beside her and watched the winter fields go by outside the window. Her sister, Adwoa, who had been watching her read, said, "How do you feel?" "Fine," Marguerite said. "Don't do that." Margaret looked at her. Adwoa was 61 and had been a family court judge for 14 years, and was one of the only people on earth who could say "don't do that" to Marguerite without it landing wrong. "I feel," Marguerite said slowly, "like I've watched someone walk confidently into a room I've been in for 30 years and announce they've discovered it." Adwoa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Céline? Céline believes in him." "That wasn't the question." Marguerite looked back out the window. The fields were flat and white and went on for a long time. "Céline will be fine," she said. "She always is. She got that from somewhere." Adwoa made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She got it from you." "I know," Marguerite said. "That's what I meant." What Rowan had not known, because Marguerite had never told him and had no reason to, was that she had spent the previous 18 months in quiet negotiations with a pension fund based in Ottawa. The pension fund was called Rideau Institutional Capital. It managed assets on behalf of a consortium of public sector unions across 3 provinces, and it had been for a long time looking for a way to diversify into alternative investments managed by firms with strong track records, and specifically, with leadership that reflected the communities its beneficiaries came from. The managing director of Rideau was a woman named Dr. Félicité Marcoux-Obi, who had called Marguerite at a conference in Montreal 2 years ago and said, over coffee at 7 in the morning before the session started, "We've been watching your returns for 8 years. We think you're undercapitalized for what you're actually capable of." Marguerite had looked at her over the coffee cup and said, "How much are we talking about?" Dr. Marcoux-Obi had told her. Marguerite had kept her face very still. "I'll need to run some numbers." "Of course," Dr. Marcoux-Obi had said. "Take whatever time you need." And then, with the half-smile of someone who has done this before, but not too long, the negotiations had taken 18 months because Rideau was a pension fund, and pension funds do not move quickly, and because the due diligence process had been thorough in the way that only institutional money is thorough, not suspicious, just careful, methodical, the way you are when you are responsible for other people's retirements. Marguerite had answered every question. She had opened every file. She had sat across the table from Rideau's risk committee, on 3 separate occasions and explained, in precise and patient detail, how Osei-Bonsu Capital Partners had built its track record, and why it was durable, and what the next 10 years looked like. The agreement was finalized on a Thursday in March, 6 weeks after Rowan's piece in the Globe. The capital commitment was significant enough that Marguerite's firm effectively doubled in size overnight. Not in headcount, she was careful about headcount, but in assets under management, in institutional credibility, in the particular weight that comes from having a partner who has done their homework and decided you are exactly who they were looking for. Tobias sent a brief announcement to the firm's contact list on a Friday afternoon. It was factual, appropriately understated. It mentioned Rito's mandate, the scope of the partnership, and a quote from Dr. Marguerite Osei about long-term value creation. It did not mention Rowan at all. There was no reason to. Céline called on Saturday morning. She had, Marguerite knew, seen the announcement. Probably multiple people had forwarded it to her. Probably some of them had done so with the specific intention of making a point. Mom, Céline said, and her voice had that careful quality it sometimes got. The one that meant she was trying to hold several feelings at once and wasn't sure which one to lead with. Hi, sweetheart. The Rito announcement. A pause. How long has that been in the works? A while, Marguerite said. Another pause. Marguerite could hear Céline breathing, could picture her standing in the kitchen of the house she shared with Rowan in Leslieville, probably looking out the window at the backyard, where there was a garden she'd planted 2 summers ago that she was very proud of. You didn't tell me, Céline said. It wasn't quite an accusation, it was confidential until it closed. Rowan didn't know. The pause this time was longer. Mom, I don't know if that was, I understand the confidentiality. But don't you think, Céline? Marguerite kept her voice gentle. When Rowan left, did he tell you about the Wellington Street meeting? The one with Clifford Adebayo? Silence. Did he tell you he'd spoken to Femi and to David before he handed in his letter? More silence. Did he tell you he'd filed the incorporation papers for the new fund 5 months before he resigned? The silence that came after that one was a different kind. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. He said it came together quickly, Céline said quietly. I know he did. Mom, her voice had shifted. What do you think of him, really? Not the professional stuff. What do you actually think? Marguerite sat with that for a moment. She was in her living room, in the Rosedale house she'd lived in for 20 years, with the early morning light coming in through the east windows the way it did in spring, soft and long in particular. I think, she said carefully, that Rowan is a man who looks at the people around him and sees what they represent to him, not who they actually are, and I think that's a hard way to love someone. Céline was quiet for a long time. I've been thinking the same thing, she finally said, for a while now. I know. How did you know? Because you're my daughter, Marguerite said. And you notice things. You just sometimes decide not to, because it's easier. She paused. That's not a criticism, I've done it too. They stayed on the phone for another hour, not always talking. Sometimes just existing in the same connection, which is its own kind of conversation. The industry event was in May, at the Fairmont Royal York. It was one of those annual dinners that the financial community in Toronto puts on. The kind where everyone who matters is in the same room and everyone knows it, and the point is partly the award and partly just the being there. Marguerite was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement recognition from the Canadian Association of Alternative Investment Managers. She had known about this since January. She had written a short acceptance speech and shown it to Adwoa, who had said it was too short, and then shown it to Tobias, who said it was perfect and she had kept it as is. She arrived without a date. She had been doing that for a long time. She wore a deep green gown she'd had made by a designer in Little Portugal, who had been dressing her for 12 years. And she stood at the pre-dinner reception with a glass of water and spoke to colleagues. She respected and a few she merely tolerated and one she actively disliked, all with the same courteous attention. Rowan was there, she had known he would be. It was that kind of room. He was across the ballroom when she first saw him, talking to a man she didn't recognize. He was wearing a very good suit. He looked, from a distance, exactly like the version of himself he had always been trying to project, confident, successful, central to whatever was happening around him. She watched him for a moment, the way you watch weather from inside. He saw her eventually. She could tell by the slight change in his posture, the way his shoulders came back half an inch. He said something to the man he was talking to and crossed the room, and when he reached her, he smiled, the warm, practiced smile, and said, "Congratulations, Marguerite. The Rito deal. That's significant." "Thank you," she said. "I have to say, I didn't see that coming." He said it lightly, like a compliment, like he was granting her something. She looked at him for a moment, not coldly. She was not a cold person, despite what some people assumed, just clearly. "No," she said, "I don't imagine you did." She excused herself to speak to Dr. Marguerite Osei, who was standing near the windows with a glass of white wine. And she did not look back. The speech she gave that night was short. She talked about starting the firm in 1997 in a rented office with one other person, a woman named Brina Kowalski-Asare, who had been her first hire and was now the firm's chief risk officer, and was sitting in the front row in a red blazer, laughing at something the person next to her had said. She talked about what it had been like to be the only black woman in certain rooms, and then the first, and then one of several, and how that arc was not finished but it was real. She talked about capital as a tool, not an end, about what it meant to steward other people's futures, whether you were managing a pension fund or a private portfolio, or the savings of someone who had worked 30 years and needed the money to hold. She said, "The most important thing I've learned is that power doesn't announce itself. It just does the work, and eventually the work speaks." She thanked Brenna, she thanked Tobias, she thanked her daughter who was in the audience. Celine had come alone, and Marguerite had felt something careful and hopeful about that. And she thanked her sister Adwoa, who was also there, and who made a face at being mentioned publicly. She did not mention Rowan. There was no reason to. In June, Celine filed for separation. She told Marguerite on a Sunday, over brunch at a place on Queen Street they'd been going to for years, a small room with mismatched chairs and very good eggs Benedict and an owner who knew their order. She said it matter-of-factly, in the way she delivered hard news when she had already finished grieving the version of things she'd hoped for. "It's been coming for a while," she said. "I know, I need to do this on my own. I don't want." She paused, looked at her coffee. "I don't want it to be a whole thing with the firm or the lawyers or any of that. I just want it to be between us." "That's your decision to make. He'll probably try to make it complicated." "Probably. You're not going to say anything?" "What would you like me to say?" Celine looked at her. Then she laughed. Not happily exactly, but fully, the way she'd laughed since she was small, with her whole face. "I'd like you to say something wise and annoying that I'll only understand in 6 months." Marguerite considered this seriously. "All right," she said. "When someone shows you that they see the world only through themselves, believe them early. It saves a lot of time." Celine held her coffee cup in both hands. "That's it? That's it. It's not that wise. Give it 6 months." By autumn, the fund Rowan had launched was struggling. Not failing, precisely. It was too early for that. But the early returns were below projections, and one of the 2 managing directors had quietly withdrawn. The anchor commitment from Clifford Adebayo had not expanded the way Rowan had apparently expected. The Globe had not run a follow-up. Marguerite knew this not because she was watching, but because Toronto's financial community is not large and information moves the way information moves in any professional village. People mention things. She listened and said little and went back to work. Osei-Bonsu Capital Partners, by contrast, was in a period of what Tobias described in a monthly summary as structured expansion. They had added 3 people to the investment team, opened a small office in Vancouver, and were in early conversations with a foundation based in Edmonton that was interested in impact-aligned mandates. Marguerite worked long hours and took the weekends she needed, and called her sister on Thursdays, and had dinner with Celine twice a month. She ran on the trails near the brickworks when the weather allowed. She read novels she never had time for during busy periods, and she corresponded with a professor at Rotman she'd been meaning to connect with for years, about a research project on institutional trust and alternative asset management. She was not triumphant. Triumph would have required her to have been injured, and she had been careful for 30 years not to be. What she was on a Tuesday evening in late October, standing at her office window after everyone had gone home, watching the lights come on across the city in the particular early winter way they do in Toronto when the days are already short and the sky goes from pale to dark very fast. What she was in that moment was simply here. She had been here the whole time. She thought about Rowan's face at the Fairmont, the slight recalibration in his shoulders when he saw her. She thought about Celine laughing over eggs Benedict. She thought about Marku Obi at 7 in the morning in Montreal, saying, "We think you're undercapitalized for what you're actually capable of." She thought about all the rooms she had been in over 30 years where someone had looked at her and seen a figurehead, a name, a placeholder, an obstacle, a symbol, anything other than the person who had actually built the thing they were standing inside. She had never argued with them. She had never needed to. The city was lit up below her. The lake was somewhere out there in the dark. She had a 7 o'clock tomorrow and a board call next week and a flight to Vancouver at the end of the month. And she had her daughter, who was learning the particular and hard-won freedom of understanding what you actually need. And her sister, who would call on Thursday. Marguerite Osei-Bonsu picked up her coat, turned off the light, and went home. She had always known exactly who she was. It simply took everyone else a little longer to catch up.